In the book, you use the term the Great Awokening for this event. What happened?
A lot of these shifts, actually, they weren't like broad-based social shifts. It was a very particular slice of society that changed. These changes put us increasingly out of step with a lot of the rest of society. There were previous cases of awakenings. This isn't the first awakening. Probably won't be the last either.
This is an elite phenomenon. A term that you use is symbolic capitalists.
Symbolic capitalists are people who make a living by manipulating ideas and symbols instead of providing physical goods and services to people. The top 1% don't control most of America's wealth. They don't control anything near a majority of America's wealth. We have to look at the super rich in conjunction with symbolic capitalists. When you look at the effects of these awakenings, you don't see a radical redistribution of wealth and opportunities and resources from elites downwards. That basically never happened. For every dollar that's earmarked to the poor, only about 5 cents of it actually reaches the poor. When you tax the rich, and it ends up in institutions that symbolic capitalists control, and then we eat most of it, and then we sprinkle the crumbs on the poor. You can just keep taking money from the rich, and we'll just keep eating the 95% of it.
It'll be useful for us to start by trying to define woke, perhaps as a complex sociological event that really took off in the early 2010s and has only really started slowing down over the past few years, I guess. In the book, you use the term the Great Awokening for this event that took place. Yeah. What happened?
Yeah, so one of the big projects of the book is, starting in the early 2010s, we started seeing things like blow-ups on campuses, a lot of heightened contestation over identity issues and things like this. A lot of people were trying to figure out what's going on. A lot of the conversation that people were having about what was changing or whether things were changing was kind of vibes-based or anecdotes-based. So like something would happen in one particular place and people would make really strong claims on the basis of this one incident. And as a sociologist, I thought, well, if there is some big cultural shift underway, that should be a thing that we can measure. We can look at changes in protest activity. We can look at changes in corporate policies and corporate statements. We can look at cancel culture incidents on colleges and universities. We can look at trends in media discourse and in academic literature or in book publications. We can look at trends in entertainment media, how much do they lean into moralistic language, how has representation changed on television shows. You saw this kind of radical uptick in the number of queer characters and the number of non-white characters. And when we look in finer grained detail into what changed and who changed, we see a couple things. One of the things we see is that a lot of these shifts, actually, they weren't like broad-based social shifts. It was a very particular slice of society that changed. Namely, people who work in the knowledge profession, the symbolic professions, people who work in fields like journalism and education, consulting, finance, law, and people who make a living manipulating symbols and ideas and so on. We changed. Our communities changed. Our institutions changed a lot. Much of the rest of society didn't shift actually that much. These changes put us increasingly out of step with a lot of the rest of society. So even under ordinary circumstances, the kind of people who work in the symbolic professions tend to be kind of funky compared to the rest of society. Like the ways we think about politics are unusual. The ways we engage in political activity are unusual. During this period of awakening, the gap between us and everyone else grew because, again, like we shifted a lot while most other people stayed on the same trajectory that they were on. A lot of us noticed that this gap is growing. And our story of what's going on, why the gap is growing between us and other people, is that we assume we haven't shifted much. And the reason the gap is growing is because those people have suddenly got a lot more racist and sexist and things like that. But what I show in the book is that's not the case. Actually, if anything, the rest of society has been staying on the same trajectory they've been on, which is like kind of growing marginally more progressive over time on a lot of these cultural issues, but mostly consistent. And the reason the gap is growing is truly it's because of knowledge economy professionals. Another thing that you can see when you kind of measure these shifts in a more disciplined way, you can see that the same period of shifting that we saw after 2010 does seem to have peaked around 2021 or so, and is now in the decline. Now, we're not back in 2009 or anything like that, but there does seem to have been another shift that took place. And then the last thing I'll say for right now, to kind of kick off the conversation, is that one virtue of taking this kind of measurement approach to these cultural shifts is that we can actually see that this period of contestation and change we saw after 2010 was actually a case of something, and that there were previous cases of awakenings. This isn't the first awakening. It's not the probably won't be the last either. Bad news for people who didn't particularly love this episode. And so one of the things I show in the book is that in the 20th century, there were 3 previous awakenings. There was one in the 1920s to the early 30s. There was one in the mid-1960s to the early 70s. That one's probably not a surprise to anyone. There was one in the late 80s to early 90s, which was the last time we had these big blow-ups over what they called political correctness at the time. But today we call it wokeness. And then we had the last one over 2010. And the nice thing about being able to recognize this as a case and kind of comparing them, we can get leverage on questions like, why do these awakenings happen? Why don't they go on forever? Do they actually change anything? What do they change? And so on. And so that's some of the questions that I kind of take up in a second.
It seemed obvious from a vibes level, but you actually found the empirical data to suggest that this is an elite phenomenon. This is not a bottom-up, we want change, grassroots revolution. This is very much, a term that you use is symbolic capitalists.
Yes.
Which seems central to the phenomenon that we're looking at, the Great Awakening. So maybe we can get into to describe what is a symbolic capitalist, and why would they be enacting a kind of elite revolution from the top?
So the we and we have never been woke is this group of elites that I call symbolic capitalists. So a symbolic capitalist is someone who makes a living based on what they know, who they know, and how they're known. That is, they make a living by kind of cultivating and leveraging symbolic capital, which is a sociological symbolic capital on behalf of themselves and other people. So as a less nerdy way of saying that, symbolic capitalists are people who make a living by manipulating ideas and symbols instead of providing physical goods and services to people. They're people who work in fields like, as I mentioned before, like law, consulting, finance, science and technology, education, and so on. If you look at the kind of pay that symbolic capitalists tend to enjoy, the kind of autonomy that we have compared to most other workers and how we structure our time and what we work on and how we work on it and so on, if you look at the social prestige that we enjoy compared to most other workers, they're very high. And from the beginning of our professions, we've said, the reason you should give us this pay, this autonomy, this prestige, it's not for our own sake. You should give us these things because it'll better empower us to help everyone in society, including and especially the least among us, the marginalized and the disadvantaged. And so there's this kind of interesting phenomenon with symbolic capitalists where our claims for power and status and resources and opportunities are kind of bound up with our narratives about being advocates and allies for the vulnerable and marginalized in society. Journalists are supposed to speak truth to power and be a voice for the voiceless, and academics are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads and to tell the truth without worrying about anyone else's political interests or economic interests. So our professions, again, they're just defined in terms of altruism, the common good. And this fact creates this kind of unique form of status competition within these professions. So for a century now, as I show in the book, it's been the case that people who do an especially good job within these professions of painting themselves as kind of having the right motives, of being especially committed to these social justice causes, of being especially effective at representing these marginalized voices, they're seen as being especially worthy of power and status, things like this. On the flip side, people who are successfully painted as having the wrong motives or being in bed with the wrong people and that kind of stuff, they can find their position in these professions jeopardized or can even lose their job. And that wasn't something that started with Twitter. That's been going on for a century, as I show in the book. There's basically two things that you see that consistently predict when an awakening will happen. The first one is that they tend to occur during periods of elite overproduction. Now, elite overproduction is a situation where society is producing more people that have a reasonable expectation to be elites than we have the capacity to actually give them the lives that they were expecting and taking for granted. So when you have growing numbers of people who did everything right, they stayed in school, they got good grades, they did the right extracurricular activities, they got into a good college, they majored in the right things, and they were expecting a 6-figure salary and to be able to buy a house and get married and have a nice, stable, professional job and all of this kind of stuff. When growing numbers of people who kind of took for granted that that was going to be their future suddenly find that that life is just not available to them, what they often do is they indict the social order that they think failed them, and they try to tear down some of the people at the top in order to make room for themselves and tear down their competitors in order to make room for themselves. And this is why cancellation is an important aspect of all of these awakenings as well, is because what they are at bottom are power struggles between existing elites and elite aspirants over kind of scarce resources. Now the second big predictor, so elite overproduction is the main driver in various kinds of elite crises. But that's not sufficient to predict these awakenings, in part because there's this kind of counter-cyclical nature sometimes between the fortunes of elites and non-elites, which is to say, often when times are kind of tough for elites, they're okay for other people. And if you're in that kind of a situation where some subset of elites is having a tough time, but everyone else is doing fine, then no one cares about elite problems. Like, no one's pulling out their violin like, oh, poor elite. You have to get a normal job and live a normal life like everyone else? Like, no one cares. But there are some times when these trajectories get collapsed, when things have been kind of bad and growing worse for ordinary people for a while, and all of a sudden they're bad for a lot of elites too. And those are the moments when awakenings are likely to happen, because you have these kind of frustrated elites who want to indict the prevailing order and things like this. But there's this, they have more leverage over the system than they normally would, because there's this mass of other people who are also really angry about the way things are going, who also have a bone to pick with the people who have been running the show. And so this gives these elites more leverage than they normally would have when they're frustrated and suffering. So those are the two factors that seem to, when you have elite overproduction plus popular immiseration interacting at the same time, those are moments when things are kind of ripe for an awakening. Yeah.
You've come at this from a perspective of an older, I say older because it's not the new left, an older economic left, and you were critiquing from the left in this case. It might be easier for someone like you to make these critiques than someone, say, that's on the right or outside of these professions. It's interesting that you say we. You're always saying we.
It would hit different though if it was called "You Have Never Been Woke."
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So how has it been received?
The critical reception has been pretty positive on the whole, but it's funny. There's so many kind of funny things about how the way the book was. So for one, when I was on the academic job market as a sociologist, sociology, overwhelmingly left field, like 11-1 Democrats to Republicans in the field of sociology. Even though I was coming from an Ivy League school, I had letters of recommendation from really prestigious academics. I had a lot of academic journal publications. I checked diversity boxes. One would assume I would just sail through the job market, right? That was not my experience. I went on the market 3 times and I couldn't get a job. So ultimately, I got a job outside of my field. So I am a tenure-line professor at an R1 research university, but notice I am not a professor of sociology because sociologists were very averse to, were kind of risk averse. Ironically, now that the book has come out and it's been a big success, all of a sudden the field of sociology loves me. So they had me on the.
Well, I have seen recently from a zeitgeist level, the left is trying to reclaim some of that older footing of the economic left. This kind of hyper-identity politics seems to be on the wane.
Yeah. Well, and you know what? I think part of, I think So one thing that's important is I think part of the project of the book, I think the book gives people a lot of new information that they won't have. People will read the book and you'll go, oh, I didn't know that. Like hopefully it presents new data, it does new analysis. But like part of the project of the book wasn't just to present new information that people didn't have, but it was to provide a kind of language and a framework and social permission for people to talk about things they did notice, and so that they already did perceive, that they already did understand, but didn't have a good way of talking about, didn't feel comfortable talking about. And so one of the things that's been very clear to me as I talk to people about the book, including and especially people on the left, is that some of these tendencies are things that other people have been bothered by on the left and that they've noticed, but that they haven't felt comfortable talking about or didn't know how to talk about in a way that they could be like, that the people that they're trying to reach could actually hear them. Yeah. And so I think one of the keys to the book's success is that it does this. It creates a space for people to talk about these things in a way that they might not have been able to otherwise. The book is like a physical embodiment of some of the things that it criticizes. It's like so for instance, one of the things that I criticize in the book a lot is the use of credentials, and especially elite credentials, to decide who's worth listening to, whose perspectives that you should take seriously. But notice, the book is published by Princeton University Press, right? And I targeted them specifically because I understood that a book that had that Princeton logo on it would be taken more seriously and so on. And then likewise, the book criticizes the way a lot of elites leverage their these kind of collective identities like Black or Muslim or whatever in order to advance their own individual ends. So they appeal to collectives in order to advance themselves without doing much to help other people. But it's also true that part of the reason Princeton was interested in this book is because I'm Black. So it's not the case that, Princeton just gives contracts to all the Blacks, like Oprah style, like you get a car, right? It's not like all Black people get a Princeton book. They didn't just publish it because I'm Black, but it's definitely the case that the book was more attractive to Princeton in part because it's a book by an early career Black scholar. It's also the case that part of the reason I had the freedom to just go pew, pew, pew and say what I think about a lot of these issues is because I'm a Black Muslim author who writes for The Guardian. So if I had written this exact same manuscript, but I was a cisgender, heterosexual white male, especially, God forbid, if I had any whiff of conservatism or evangelical Christianity about me, probably the publisher wouldn't have published this book. It would have been perceived as too risky or so on. And even if they did publish it, they probably would have had sensitivity readers and a whole bunch of other layers like this to kind of to defang it as much as possible. And it probably would have been received in a different way. The exact same book might have been received in a very different way if you color swap me. And
so you're like Neo in the leftist matrix. It's like you're the one. You might be able to actually get something done.
Well, but it's ironic, right? Because it's some of the very dynamics that the book is criticizing partially explain why the book was able to be received in the spirit that it's intended.
Part of the reason I was invited here to have this conversation is that I've been looking at it from an ideological level and a sociological one, but from the inside of the ideology. And more recently, I've been actually looking at, you could say, radical ideologies on the right. A popular thinker on the right now is James Burnham. And he had a book entitled The Managerial Revolution. Yeah. And so he was an old Trotskyist turned conservative. He had an idea that the old ownership class, the bourgeoisie, they were being deposed by a managerial class, a class that weren't necessarily the billionaires and the legacy families, but the people who were managing society, and their wages might be a bit lower, but they were the people with the power. And so I find this interesting because you're trying to, in some sense, save the left from the derangements of woke, I would say, and bring it back to a more economic footing. But in the meantime, the right is using thinkers like James Burnham to steal economic left interests and bring them over to the right. So MAGA thinkers are a bit like this.
So this is a new thing. Usually the bosses and the workers haven't been in the same party because they have actually divergent interests on a lot of things, right? But increasingly, the big divide isn't between the bosses and the workers or the rich and the poor. It's between people who work in the symbolic professions and people who don't. So people who work in manufacturing, people who work in materials extraction, people who are service workers. You're seeing this increasing shift over the last decade to the Republican Party. And this is actually unusual. And actually you see the same thing on the other end when you look at people who, what you would expect based on traditional class analysis is that like the adjunct and the tenure line professor would say, in virtue of making very different incomes and having very different risk exposures and all that kind of stuff, you would expect that they would think about the world in very different ways, that they would have very different political alignments and things like that. That's not the case. And the people who are more precarious at the bottom and the people who are more affluent at the top in the symbolic professions, and in fact even their CEOs in these companies as well, they all tend to vote for they all tend to actually vote for in very similar ways and share very similar politics. Like if you look at who is it that really resents the millionaires and the billionaires and things like this?
It's the academics.
Yeah, it's actually not the kind of working class people or poor people or even just middle class. They often actually admire people who are successful. They want to be like them. They want to emulate them. Or in any case, they enjoy watching their exploits and stuff like this.
Yeah.
The people who really hate the top 1% are the people are people in like are the top 20%. Basically, are the people who hate the top 1%.
Want to get there.
And on the other hand, as you said, the people who are like working class people, for instance, the people who they really resent are the managers. It's actually the managers that are the ones who are imposing on them in various ways. The managers seem like the most direct obstacle when they're trying to get a lot of things done. There's this other book by Anand Giridharadas. It's called Winners Take All. What the book is about how the millionaires and the billionaires and multinational corporations, they're kind of narrowly focused on maximizing profits, and as a result of that, they create all these social problems because they're not. And then they use philanthropy, donations, and stuff like that to paint themselves as the good guys, as the solutions to the problems that they themselves created. One of the things that's interesting, though, about that story that Giridharadas tells is if you look at like how anything actually happens in that story, who's doing it. The millionaires and the billionaires, they actually don't do much in that story. Like, so for instance, who is it that's writing the PR that helps them launder this money and launder their reputations? Who is it that's producing these fawning media interviews after they make these donations? Who is it that's moving the money around and filing the paperwork? Who is it that's administering these nonprofits and stuff that they create? Almost every single step in that process, it's done with and through symbolic capitalists, and it couldn't happen without us. Yes. We're the ones who make the stuff happen. Like they're not interviewing themselves and then writing their own fawning interview and then publishing and editing it and publishing it themselves,
right? Behind the scenes PR and
that's
press
all done. It's us. We're the ones who do every single part of that. So to the extent that we just focus on the top 1% and we talk about how they're trying to launder their money and their reputations, like it's good to focus on how the top 1% and multinational corporations and so on contribute to social problems and then try to absolve themselves of blame for them. That's a worthy thing to talk about. But when you actually pay attention to how does that actually happen, who's actually doing that, that's us. So this is why I think it's actually important to discuss both of these groups together and to look at the relationship between them in a way that people don't like to do. So as you said, on the Republican side, they want to focus on the managers exclusively and kind of ignore the millionaires and the billionaires. In most fields like mine, what we want to do is focus on the top 1% and ignore the other people. But you don't get a good picture. There's so many problems with just focusing on the top 1%, but I'll give one more example. So in the United States, if you look at the distribution of wealth, the top 1% control about 26% of America's wealth. Now that's wild. You have 1% of the population that controls more than a quarter of the wealth in the richest country on the planet, maybe the richest country that has ever existed. That's a wild amount of resources in the hands of a very small number of people. But notice, the top 1% don't control most of America's wealth. They don't control anything near a majority of America's wealth. Yeah. If you only focus on the top 1%, you miss the overwhelming majority of wealth in America. Who has it? How is it leveraged? In the service of what ends? You miss all of that. So what if you zoom out a little bit and you look at the top 20%? So you look at the millionaires and the billionaires. You don't drop them from, but you look at the millionaires and the billionaires and also the upper middle class. Well, then you can account for well over 70% of America's wealth. Another way of saying that is that 80% of Americans have to make do with just a small fraction of with about 28% of America's wealth, because the millionaires and the billionaires and the upper middle class together eat up almost all of it and then just kind of sprinkle the crumbs on everyone else. And so if you only focus on the top 1%, though, you miss most of the country's wealth. If you zoom out just a little bit more, you actually can account for most of it, and you can get a clearer sense, again, of like who benefits, how do they benefit, how does stuff actually happen, where is the money actually going? And what Richard Reeves showed in his book, Dream Hoarders, I don't know why I'm plugging other people's books, just read my book, but as Richard Reeves showed in his book, Dream Hoarders, if you want to understand a lot of social phenomena like declining social mobility, economic stagnation, it's actually not enough you can't actually explain a lot of that stuff with the top 1%. What he shows is that the top 20%, opportunity hoarding among the top 20%, is what explains a lot of these things. So his story basically is that people who are in the upper middle class have basically created these glass floors for their children to prevent their children, to help make sure that their children reproduce their own social position, do at least as good as they did, or do a little better, or in any case, not much worse. Now this is a problem though, because there's only so much room at the top of any distribution. There's only so many people can be at the top. And so if you create a situation where no one can go down, no one who's at the top can actually go down, then eventually it becomes difficult for anyone else to go up either. And so this tendency of upper middle class people to kind of hoard opportunities for their own children, to make sure their own children reproduce their own social position, is actually one of the main drivers of declining social mobility, declining economic dynamism, and stuff like that. If you want to actually have those things, there needs to actually be a cycling of elites. It needs to be the case that some of the elites go down a bit more than has been the case. And so, again, it's really important to focus on the millionaires and the billionaires. We shouldn't ignore them. But we can't actually understand as much as we want to about this, about society, about the economy, about anything, if we just focus on the super rich. We have to look at the super rich in conjunction with symbolic capitalism.
Andrew Breitbart famously said that politics is downstream from culture. A lot of people say that he's one of the people who started the culture wars, but I think we can go further back and say that culture is downstream from the academy. A lot of our elites do go through the academy. They learn how to behave, they learn theories of the world, and then they move out into our most influential parts of society. So we're talking journalism, we're talking this symbolic capitalist.
Yeah, I mean, so the role of universities has actually, for marking for deciding who gets to be an elite, has actually become more and more important, because it wasn't actually the case before that a lot of these jobs were gate-kept by college degrees. So for instance, journalists. If you look at the 1970s, only a little over half of journalists had college degrees. And the people who had college degrees had degrees in lots of different stuff. Today, 95% of journalists have college degrees, and as more people have had college degrees, then it matters more and more where you got your degree from. So in outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post, they actually have higher concentrations of Ivy League graduates than like the Senate or the Fortune 500 list, Forbes 500 list, and so on. Can
I just bring a little anecdote about the Great Awokening with this journalist thing? Because I was working in a newsroom Through university, I was just a cameraman, so it's a pretty simple job once you've got the technical stuff down. So I was able to watch the news gathering process. And so what I was seeing was a lot of these kind of mean girls journalists coming in that were my age or younger, the millennials. And the kind of older tradesman journalists, they were all moving out, horrified at the culture that was changing. It's not just the internet that changed the dynamics of the media journalism world. It's something generational, I would say, and the universities.
Well, you know what? So there's two. One of the things that's so fascinating to me about the cultural dynamics of universities and a lot of these other spaces, because they pick people almost exclusively from universities now. So this culture is now the culture of most of the symbolic professions, is that on paper, academics have a lot of freedom. Like we have in the States, we have really robust protections for freedom of inquiry, for freedom of conscience, for freedom of speech. When you go in the States, if you take one of these cases to court, if someone violates your rights and you go to court, you win, like seriously, you win these free speech cases and adjacent freedom cases, like 80% of the time. David French, who's a lawyer who litigates a lot of these cases, he says, like, being a First Amendment lawyer is great. It's mostly just showing up to court, collecting your W's, and then going to the next courtroom and collecting your paycheck.
Right. Yeah.
And so on paper, academics are in the U.S. are freer than almost any other type of profession. They're freer than they've been almost at any time in the past on paper. The sphere of rights that academics has actually been growing. Relative to academics in almost any other country, we have a lot more freedom. But if you look at how free are academics to express themselves, how willing are they to express themselves, much less likely than typical America. So most other workers in the States, they have zero rights of in private. If you work for a private corporation or something like that in the United States, you have absolutely zero rights of free speech. You don't even, not even the First Amendment covers you. You have no free speech rights, no rights to privacy, no freedom of association, no freedom of conscience. You have absolutely no formal freedoms.
It's etiquette. It's etiquette. It's etiquette within a class.
And this is what's striking. Yes, if you work normie jobs, you don't see this kind of censorship. So I worked freight for a while. Yeah. If you work these kinds of jobs, when you're there and you're hauling the stuff, and like people will talk about all sorts of stuff. They'll just say what they think, and they'll get into arguments with each other, and they'll talk back to the boss, and all of that kind of stuff. You don't see this. One of the things that's striking is when you look at a lot of the symbolic professions, like if you look at workplaces like Google. These workplaces are very unstructured. There's not a lot of rules. There's not a lot of people directly managing you. Like the narrative that we tell about why our workspaces are often like this is because you can't control us. We're just too free-spirited. We're like cats. You can't hurt us. But the truth is, the reason why these workplaces are structured like that is because you actually don't need to manage us. We aggressively manage ourselves, and we manage and supervise our peers too. Yeah, we've totally internalized it.
Internalized management.
Other workers, if you want to, you often have to like coerce extra labor out of them. We kind of willfully let our work encroach on our lives, and we brag about how overworked and how tired we are, and how we. We've just totally drank the Kool-Aid, but we like think of ourselves as these rebels and so on. And so this is one of these kind of cultural contradictions that I talk about. Last thing I'll say real quick. One thing that's really important to note, though, about this kind of culture that prevails in a lot of these institutions like higher ed, is the people who suffer most from it are often not the people that most academics and so on would assume. So for instance, if you look at who in America is most likely to hold socially conservative views, who's most likely to be religious, and so on, it tends to be racial and ethnic minorities, immigrants, lower income people, people from kind of more rural and backgrounds and small towns, so people who are already underrepresented in these institutions. So if you create an atmosphere that's hostile towards socially conservative and religious views, the people who are going to suffer most from that are people who are already underrepresented in the academy, racial and ethnic minorities, poorer people, and so on. And on the flip side, if you look at who is it that's most likely to self-identify as an anti-racist, as a feminist, as an ally to LGBTQ people, as an environmentalist, who is it that's most likely to, it's people who are already overrepresented, who already dominate these institutions, highly educated, people whose parents were highly educated, people who are relatively affluent, people urban and suburban, people, whites. Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why these views, why these kind of woke views dominate these institutions is because they're the views of the dominant group. And so if you make it easier to police anyone who strays from that, you think about who is it that's going to say the wrong thing, that hasn't mastered these scripts of what's the right thing to say at the right time, how do you say the right thing in the right way. If you look at who is it that's going to be less likely to have mastered that kind of etiquette, it's going to be people who are already who are from non-traditional elite backgrounds and people who are from underrepresented backgrounds. And so when you create these systems, what you actually make it easier to do is basically police people who are already underrepresented. This is one example of a phenomenon you see a lot, where systems and institutions that are supposed to help and represent the marginalized and the disadvantaged primarily harm the very populations that they're supposed to be helping.
We have never been woke. Does anyone have a question that they want to ask?
You wrote this about the United States, that's where you live, that's where you work, that's what you've seen. You read it from an ideological point of view. Have you seen this anywhere else, or you just haven't had time to see if it correlates with Europe, with Australia?
So you do see a lot of these trends do have analogs in other, especially weird countries, so Western, highly educated, industrialized, rich democratic countries. You see some similar trends. So in the UK, for instance, you actually see some of these similar dynamics within these institutions, and you will even see some of the same political divides emerging, where the Labour Party has increasingly become the party of symbolic capitalists, and people who live in communities that are kind of further from London and places like that, and people who work in industries that are kind of further from tech and education and stuff like that, people who are producing physical goods and services to people and so on, have been drifting more towards Tories. You see similar, Piketty has shown that you see similar kinds of realignments happening in France as well. I don't know enough about the Australian, but my impression from talking to people here is that you're seeing a similar kind of realignment and some of these same tensions here.
Yeah. I think there are nuances, but yeah, speaking to a lot of academics over the years, the basics are the same. There's a lot of similarity here. Yeah.
I have a question more on like free speech in America and what's happening in academia and stuff. It seems like institutions like Harvard, they're like, if you don't toe the line, like you can't have international, we'll take away funding, you can't have international students. So there seems to be a lot of suppression.
Yeah, so one of the things that I talk about in the book is that these periods of awakening almost always result in significant backlash against our institutions. And this is because, as I mentioned, you see this gap growing between us. The gap is always kind of big, but it grows. But people also tend to care about the gap more as the awakening goes on because of how we conduct ourselves. So we become really militant about mocking and deriding and censoring and so on people who disagree with us, even for positions that we ourselves adopted 10 minutes ago. So, we just decided 10 minutes ago that all the police need to be abolished, but if you disagree with me with this view that I just adopted yesterday, I'm going to call you a racist, right? Because of the ways that we conduct ourselves during these periods of awakening, people notice this gap between us and them more, and they care about it, and this creates an opportunity for political entrepreneurs, usually associated with the right, to basically campaign on bringing people like us back under control. So these kinds of narratives like higher ed has lost its way, they're not teaching the kids useful knowledge and skills, they're just indoctrinating them, or Fox News, the mainstream media is lying to you, they don't They don't care about you. They're not telling you the truth. They're just a propaganda machine for the Democratic Party. These kinds of narratives become popular in the aftermath of each of the awakenings. And it usually leads to a couple of things. You see gains for the political right in the short to medium term. This is something that you see after each of the awakenings. You see the creation of alternative knowledge economy infrastructures. So for instance, in the 60s, there was this narrative that higher ed was lost. You can't fix it. It's just been totally captured by the left. And so what do? Well, a lot of conservatives and other right-aligned people started creating think tanks, like the Cato Institution and the Heritage Foundation, to allow people who are interested in scholarship to have some life outside of the academy and to push ideas outside of the academy. In the late 80s to early 90s awakening, there was this narrative that the media was lost. So what did they do? Well, you saw, one, the creation of kind of conservative talk radio, which started dominating, and then you saw the creation of Fox News, which also eats everyone's lunch in broadcasting and has since the time that they were created. In this current period, you're seeing these moves like Elon Musk taking over Twitter, Peter Thiel acquiring Rumble, Donald Trump launching Truth Social. So you're seeing the creation of these alternative infrastructures of knowledge transmission, of symbolic transmission. The thing about it is these alternative infrastructures, like the way that they make money and the way that they get audience is by sowing mistrust in mainstream institutions and kind of perpetuating the culture wars. So if you watch Fox News, which I do a lot because I'm from a military community and a military family and so on, a very red state, at least when I was growing up, Fox News will tell you all day, every day, that the mainstream media is lying to you. You can't trust them. They hate you. They look down on you. They despise people like you. And so, like, all day, every day, they're sowing mistrust in mainstream institutions. And so this is a problem, like, to the extent that the ways that we conduct ourselves help create a market, help create dissatisfaction with us because of how we're actually behaving. So it's not the case.
That's what I was about to say. The data bears out that a lot of we're using the word narrative, but the data bears out that it's true in some sense. And so we have to be careful.
So it is the case.
We have to be careful here.
Yeah, so it is the case that during these periods of awakening, we're actually conducting ourselves often in irresponsible ways. Yeah. We're actually conducting ourselves in unusual ways.
It's very important that the institutions actually acknowledge that.
There's this impulse in some circles that what we should do is, that what we need to do is just kind of attack the right, say this is all misinformation, that kind of stuff. I think it's important not to do that. I think it's important to acknowledge some of the ways in which our institutions have failed. So we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. On the one hand, we have to affirm the value of a lot of our institutions. You know, you shouldn't burn down higher ed. Actually, it serves some important social functions. You shouldn't burn down journalism. Actually, journalism, when done well, is actually very important to democracy and so on. So we need to be able to defend our institutions while also acknowledging some of their shortcomings. We have to do both at the same time. And then the last thing I'll say, one of the things that this book does is it actually takes this, a very symmetrical approach to talking about people who are woke and also people who are kind of anti-woke and conservative. So most symbolic capitalists are on the left, but there are some symbolic capitalists who are on the right. So there are people who work in media, for instance, who are on the right. There are people in academia who are on the right. There are people in all of these industries who are on the right. One of the things that's important to note is that the folks in these industries who are kind of more right-leaning, they don't actually tend to talk and think about politics much different than the people they're criticizing. They also take symbols very seriously to the point where they think it should subordinate the kind of normie political concerns that they think wokeness is this world historical threat because they also take symbols very seriously. And the ways they engage in politics are very similar. One of the things that I do in the book is I talk about how these are tendencies of thought and action that are common to symbolic capitalists per se. Not left-line symbolic capitalists, but symbolic capitalists, period. And so to the extent that people are living similar lifestyles in the same communities, in the same institutions, and so on, I don't analyze them differently just because they think different things in their heart, right? I analyze them the same way. Yep.
The culture war is a battle of symbolic capitalists.
Yes, yeah, it's largely this. It's another intra. It's another intra symbolic.
Jimmying up the people below using media distribution and whatnot. Yes. Yeah, to bring them on side. Maybe one last question. We're doing all right for time. Yeah, one last question. Let's go.
Do you feel that throughout history, the interventions of the elites to ameliorate inequality often leads to more inequality?
So one of the things I show in the book is that when you look at the effects of these awakenings, one thing you don't see is you don't see a radical redistribution of wealth and opportunities and resources from elites downwards. That basically never happens. That's not one of the consequences. So a lot of times when people are talking about the backlash against wokeness, they describe it as a backlash against vulnerable and disadvantaged people finally having more power and resources in America. And it's like, that's not what's happening here. There actually hasn't been that distribution. The backlash is, again, against this kind of growing social distance and the perception that people like us aren't doing our job. That's the cause of the backlash. One of the things that's really interesting about symbolic capitalism is that from the beginning of our professions, we've had this fantasy, which is basically that if we can just tax Elon Musk hard enough, we can solve all the world's problems. Now, I think that it's fine to tax the rich more, but one of the things that we need to bear in mind with that kind of strategy is that it's actually kind of tough to just take money from the rich and give it directly to the poor. I mean, it's a little more possible now with platforms like Give Directly, but most commonly what happens is when you tax the rich and it ends up in institutions that symbolic capitalists control, and then we eat most of it, and then we sprinkle the crumbs on the poor. And so you can see this when you look at the beginning of the symbolic professions. At the very beginning of when we started organizing our professions in a recognizably modern form, there were these two big changes that happened around the time that the symbolic professions were created. First, there was the passage of the income tax in the US, and it was successfully defended in the Supreme Court. So this allowed the government to tax the Gilded Age elites in a way that they couldn't before. And then second, you saw the creation of big philanthropy in its recognizably modern form, major charitable foundations, the whole infrastructure for nonprofits. As a result of these two changes, there was this massive transfer of wealth from the Gilded Age elites downwards. So far, sounds good. Okay, but then where did the money actually go? So in his book, The Credential Society, the sociologist Randall Collins shows that the primary wealth transfer that happened during this period was from the rich to the upper middle class. Symbolic capitalists took from the rich and we gave to ourselves. And there were some programs that were later created for the genuinely marginalized and the disadvantaged in society. There were some ways that ordinary people were made better off eventually, but not nearly as much as could have been the case. Given the sheer amount of resources that were transferred down, the amount of it that reached the genuinely disadvantaged was very small. And this is true today. The sociologist Matt Desmond has this book, Poverty in America, and he shows that for every dollar that's earmarked to the poor, only about 5 cents of it actually reaches the poor. And this has been the chronic problem of actually taxing the rich and helping the poor is us. It's because we actually don't just take the money from the rich and give it to the poor. And actually this is one of the reasons why symbolic capitalists are big fans of redistribution, and in a way that puts them at odds with normie voters. So if you look at most workers, working class people and so on, they have a preference for what you might call pre-distribution. So what they would like is good working conditions, high pay, things like this, so that they don't need things redistributed to them. They don't want to rely on the state. They want good, well-paying, stable jobs. Who is it that really, really loves redistribution in government programs? Well, that's highly educated, relatively. It's symbolic capitalists. Redistribution is a great deal for us for a bunch of reasons. First, we consume a lot more services than most people. Being able to consume these services at affordable rates for people who are getting paid peanuts from their actual jobs, but we don't have to feel too bad about it because we can take some money from Elon Musk to make sure they don't starve, right? So it's the best of both worlds. And then in the meantime, as we're taking the money from Elon Musk to make sure they don't starve, we also take a cut from ourselves. So we get a nice extra bonus here, right? We get to exploit the workers, get these services cheap because they're getting paid subpar wages and have insecure jobs and they need to be dependent on us. We don't have to actually pay for them to live at subsistence levels because someone else is doing that. And in fact, we take a share of that money for ourselves along the journey. So it's a real good deal for us. So it's no surprise that we are very strong proponents of redistribution. You can just keep taking money from the rich, and we'll just keep eating the 95% of it. And it's true that, you know, the poor, it's better that they get that extra nickel than if they didn't get that extra nickel, right? But at the same time, that's not really an efficient way to help the poor. If we want to actually solve a lot of these problems, we need to adjust the ways that we operate. We need to adjust the way that the institutions that we control operate. There's not actually a way to solve a lot of these social problems without us adjusting our own lifestyles and expectations and norms and institutional operations and things like that.
I just want to thank you for doing your job, because over the years I've been looking at this problem within the universities, and I've just read so much bad sociology. There are so many people in your field just not doing their job. It's really great to see someone who's actually looking at the landscape as it lies.